Um, so yes, my presentation is titled "The Moral Origins of Political Violence, Right and Left-Wing Extremism in Germany." And so I'm going to be talking about German politics and forms of extremism that you see in Germany. My study was essentially, I guess I should just go ahead and go to the next slide, promote my book. This is my new book that's coming out. You can see the title there. It's with Routledge. It should be published in October, so in about a month. For everyone here or people on Zoom also.
People struggling to hear on Zoom.
Oh, really?
I don't know if I need to unmute up here or not. I don't think that Sophia was unmuted up here. It needs to be done up there. That's fine.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that would be an issue. So,
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Let's find out.
All right.
Yes, they can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay. Do you
Good.
want to
Yeah.
reiterate?
Yeah. Okay. So I was just explaining that this is my new book that's coming out, and with Routledge, it'll be published in October. And if you can kindly ask your library to order a copy, that would be very appreciated. Try and get as much distribution as possible. So, but it's basically my book. My talk today is kind of based on my book, the research I do in the book. And in my book, I study German politics in the aftermath of the 2015 refugee crisis. And so there you had all of these questions about multiculturalism, immigration, the nation, national identity in Germany. And I had a look at all of that. In the book, I talk about the rise of right-wing populism in Germany, obviously right and left-wing extremist violence, and also, the whole issue of free speech on the internet and the question of hate speech. And there are a lot of different things that are interesting for a lot of different people in philosophy, or I do analyses of political ideologies, Jan Werner Müller, for example, or Jürgen Habermas, the idea of constitutional patriotism. Anyway, I do a lot of very interesting things philosophically, theoretically, in terms of political sociology, comparative politics. There's also, it's very interesting for the development of the sociology of morality that I do in the book, which I'll discuss a little bit of here today. So that's social theory. There's a lot of things. And the book also talks about some of the things that we talked, that Dr. Moskalenko talked about in her presentation, which dealt, and in part also on online interaction, rituals between individuals sharing a shared ideological view of the world, and how that process takes place, and how it leads to potential radicalization or the political movement, the sustaining of political movements. It's also about conflict. So people who have different visions of the world, and I guess Dr. Moskalenko, okay, Sophia, she described these as illusions, shared illusions, but I would contend and say that these are actual realities these are social realities that exist in reality, and they're not simply illusions. Maybe illusion is not the right word to use to describe, but these are people's realities that they actually believe. They are emotionally invested into these realities, and for them it is not an illusion, it is real. And obviously in any society you have people who have very different views on what reality is, what constitutes a good life, a moral action, for example, what is worth pursuing. And when you have conflicts based on those, you have, or when you don't have people who have the shared visions, you have conflicts. And this is exactly what my book talks about, and my presentation today will explain a little bit about how that process takes place. And so anyway, okay, now it's not working. Oh, let's see. Let me see. I get this thing. Okay. Okay. Very good. Well, I guess I should have put on the slide the name Émile Durkheim. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Émile Durkheim. He founded sociology back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he did a lot of work in the sociology of morality. And in my book, I develop his sociology of morality very in depth. And I think it offers us a lot of tools to understand what's going on with moral behavior. And when it comes to extremism, it can help us explain why people are so emotionally invested in certain ideologies, and also how these emotional investments lead them to engage in behavior, political behavior. And I'll be talking in this case about political violence, which is, I guess, the most problematic form of political engagement. But so I think his whole theory of society and morality offers a lot of tools. And the main concept, the one thing I guess that I would like everyone to take away is the founding notion of sui generis. And that's sort of the foundation of Durkheimian sociology. And what does sui generis mean? What sui generis means, it means that something is, you have two elements that fuse together, two or more elements that fuse together, and the resulting product of that fusion is greater than the sum of the parts that led to the fusion, and it's also irreducible to the composing parts. And a very good example would be hydrogen and oxygen fusing together to create water. So you have two individual products, hydrogen and oxygen. On their own, they're just gases. We breathe them in, we breathe them out. But when they combine, we have two molecules of hydrogen and one of oxygen. It creates water. Water is something completely different than the composing parts. It's liquid, it's fluid, you can drink it, you can freeze it. Right? It has completely different properties. It acts in a completely different way than hydrogen and oxygen on their own. So when you have these, when you talk about sui generis, this is what you're talking about. You have these two, and of course water. You cannot understand water simply by looking at its composing parts. If you want to understand water, you can't just say it's the combination of hydrogen and oxygen. You have to look at water as itself, as it is the combination that it is. So you have to understand water as it exists, as it is fluid, and as it freezes. Right? It has its own properties that you have to understand. So that's the general idea of sui generis. When it comes to society, and this is where it gets very interesting, is what Durkheim he defines as the social fact is it's the product of the sui generis fusion of individual minds into what he calls a concept, or also a collective representation. And I can illustrate that, for example, if we have a stone in front of us, okay, everyone here has their own subjective perception of the stone or of this object. But if we want to communicate with each other about our subjective experiences, how are we going to do that? The only way that we can do that is by coming up with the concept of the stone. And the concept of stone that we create in our mind necessarily abstracts from individual perceptions of the stone. It abstracts into this concept which has a certain sort of permanence and a certain objectivity. It's something that is not reducible to the individual. It's something that's shared by the collective group that creates this concept. Okay? And so it has basically the same, it's like going from hydrogen and oxygen to water. You have individuals, their minds, their individual perceptions of the world fuse together and create a concept. And when you have this concept, it is irreducible to those individuals. And it's something that has its own properties that need to be studied as a product of sui generis fusion. And so yes, what we're talking about here, the collective representation, the concept, it transcends individual experience. It's a product of the collective, and it's also what constitutes the collective consciousness, right? The collective consciousness, that's also a term that Durkheim is famous for. What he's talking about is basically referring to this process. So in any, if we're talking, trying to explain this, not myself get lost. It is a rather tricky concept to understand. The collective consciousness is the result of the fusion of individual minds. So it is a state of consciousness. And it is a state of consciousness that still resides in the individual, because it's the individual minds that have fused together to create this concept. But once the concept is created, the individual reintegrates this concept into their own personality, into their own psyche. And but this part of their psyche is the collective. It comes from the collective, but it is still a part of consciousness. It is still a part of the mind. So that's what he means when he talks about the collective consciousness. And it's the collective consciousness, the collective representation in this sense, is both interior and exterior to the individual. It's simultaneously interior and exterior. It's interior to the individual because the individual has incorporated the concept into their own personal mind as something which they can use in the world to describe reality with other people, right? So it's very much integrated into their personality, but at the same time it's exterior to the individual because it is a product of shared. It's a product of a shared action. It's a product of a collective action in which a number of different individuals take part, and so in that sense it still remains exterior. So it's a bit paradoxical, I guess, but it does make sense, believe me, on that. And the other thing that's very important, this notion of sui generis, this fusion of individual minds, that's what Durkheim calls a ritual. Okay, he talks a lot about ritual in his work on religion. And he talks about how when you have a group of people coming together to form a ritual, they communicate, and there's this energy that is created, right? If you go to an Ajax game here in Amsterdam, you can feel the energy. The crowd roars with passion. You can also have the same experience in religious rituals in churches, at political events. There's this energy that is created, that is shared amongst people, and it's also a collective energy that is, I guess, sui generis. This energy that people feel. It's not simply their own passion. It's not. They contribute to that energy, but the energy is collective in this same sense of sui generis. And that's important to understand because you have this fusion of minds that creates a concept. But at the same time, it's the sharing of emotion. And so when people partake in a ritual, they receive an emotional attachment to the idea, to the concept. And depending on what kind of ritual you have, you'll create a different type of emotional connection. And when you're talking about religion, you have, I guess, a religious experience, and that's, I guess, the highest form of ritual that can exist, is the transcendent into something spiritual, something religious in that sense. Okay? But also, very importantly, as I mentioned, you have religious rituals, and this ties into the creation of the idea of the moral, what it means to be a good person, what are the moral goals that we collectively pursue, that we think are worth pursuing. And these come from religious rituals. And so when you have these big rituals, this euphoric exchange of collective energy that individuals feel traverse through their body, they have these experiences, religious experiences, and but at the same time, these emotional experiences are tied to ideas, these concepts that we have, and these concepts can take many different forms. It can take the form in a religion in the form of God, for example, and it has taken that form in very many different religions in the history of humanity. But it can also take It can also take the form in political senses as well. For example, Marxism, or if you have the idea of the nation as an idea, or the proletariat as an idea, as a concept, that we have this great emotional investment into. And when you have that combined with these rituals, you create sacred objects. And these sacred objects are also tied to a notion of good and also of evil. And of course, the sacred object is the embodiment of good. And all that the sacred object opposes is evil. That's kind of cutting it a little short, but more or less that's how it works. And these moral objects, these sacred objects, also act as moral authorities that have a legitimate authority, and so we respect the moral authority of the sacred object that we have this emotional attachment to, and there are different ways to symbolize this, but it all comes back to the same idea of the sacred. And with any morality, of course, there are rules, obligations that we are commanded to follow. You have the Ten Commandments, but you can also, if you want to look at the Bill of Rights in the United States as a form of religion, sort of 10 commandments, so to speak, that's also something very similar in a non-typically religious context. So there are these rules that we have to follow, and we do so willingly. We are very much happy to abide by these rules and fight for the moral causes that are associated with our sacred object, because we have these emotional investments into these ideas. And these are very powerful and emotional investments because, like I said, they transcend the individual. They're part of the collective experience, and they pull the individual up in that sense, out of themselves into. That's really the motivating factor, I think, when you're talking about how does morality move people, and so I said politics is a very obvious example, I think, of ritual in this sense, and so that's what I've done in my book, and what I'll be presenting here a little bit in my presentation is how can we study politics as a form of religion, including the rituals, these emotional investments that people have, as a way to help explain some of the conflicts that we see in the world today. And it's very important. I'm not sure how specialist you are in this topic, but when you talk about political ideologies as religions, often it's Eric Voegelin who's the key reference. So what I'm proposing here is an alternative approach to the study of political ideologies as religions, one that's based in Durkheim's work, not in Eric Voegelin's. So Right. Well, the title of my slide here is Political Ideologies as Religions. I guess you can't see that, but right. So in this approach that I've developed, what you do is you look at political ideologies as systems of morality. And you look at the ideology, you try to identify what its sacred objects are, what are the moral obligations that individuals are compelled to follow. And there's also this idea of the moral ideal. And that's something that I found when I was writing my book, something that was very striking, is that when I studied the discourse of political actors, very often they would describe the ideal society that they were seeking to achieve. And if you're talking about multiculturalism, they would talk about a society based on tolerance, acceptance, universal adherence of values, and so they would create this society where everyone shared these ideals, where everything would be harmonious. And when you talk to nationalists, they would talk about the nation as a more culturally homogeneous entity, where there were no conflicts about Christmas trees or Christmas celebrations at school, things like that. Everything was pretty much, for them also, it was an ideal. It was a perfect society in a very specific sense. And so you had people on all sides describing their perfect society, their ideal society. And that was really one of the motivating factors for people, is they were pursuing this ideal. And Durkheim calls it, this perfect society, he calls it a moral ideal. And I think that's really something that goes a long way to explaining political behavior, especially when it comes to conflict. And a lot of the oppositions that you find in politics today, they come from people who are seeking to achieve or realize a certain vision of society. When it comes to immigration and multiculturalism, this becomes debates about levels of immigration, refugees, what kind of policies should we have again towards Christmas, things like that. In the case of Germany, and as it pertains specifically to extremism, I wrote about two extremist groups. One was the Autonomen, which often is in the media often is described as simply Antifa. And I also looked at the NPD, the Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschlands, the National Democratic Party of Germany, which I guess, for lack of a better description, is basically a neo-Nazi party. When you read their party program, that's kind of it's a form of nationalistic socialism, and so that, I don't know. There's really not much better way to describe them, I guess. But what I find here also is that these two ideologies, basically all ideologies actually, but these two particular, the content of the ideology is radically very different. They have very opposed views on what they want to achieve in society, what they think the right society is, but they have essentially the same moral structure, which is you have a sacred object, you have moral obligations, and you have these rituals that sustain this ideological framework. And in both cases, with the Autonomen and the NPD, you have attempts to realize the moral ideal that they have. And in the case of extremist groups, this will lead to violence. So that's one of the key features about extremism, is that oftentimes they're very willing to engage in acts of violence and they act outside of the parameters of the state to achieve their goals. And but when they did so in basically the same way that other groups who do act within the parameters of the state do, which is to say that all of these groups were trying to achieve their ideal society. So just in one case they do it with the state, and in other cases they do it without the state. So for the Autonomen, this is just a very brief look at the ideology. For the Autonomen, the sacred object is a deconstructive notion of human dignity, and they say it. They have there's this document called the Theses of the Autonomen, and it's 13 theses. It's basically like the 10 Commandments of the Autonomen group. And they, in that document, they talk specifically about the notion of human dignity, and what their ideal society would be is a society free of domination and hierarchy. And what that means is they want every individual to be autonomous, to have freedom to determine their own being, their own self. They can do that also in collective groups if they choose to. So this is also a principle that applies to groups. But the idea is to create political structures, political and social structures, where there is absolutely no sense of hierarchy, where there's no one group of people that's presented as better than anyone else, that has more power than anyone else. So it's really quite radically egalitarian, I guess, when it comes to power sharing and things like that, where really every individual has the ability to create who they are without any bearing coming from above, from a political or a social structure telling them what they need to do. So it's kind of like a sort of anarchism, an organized anarchism, I guess. And so when it comes to moral obligations, what do they do to try and achieve their ideal society? Well, some of their moral obligations are to be anti-racist, to be anti-capitalist, to be anti-fascist, right? So for them, they have this idea of the sacred, which is this notion of human dignity, and what is evil, what they consider to be profanations of the highest degree of this sacred object of human dignity, are racism, capitalist domination, fascist structures, things like that. And that's because that they see these, any social institution essentially that embodies a form of hierarchy or domination, and as they understand it, is to be opposed, because it's part of the evil that does harm to their sacred object. So they have these moral obligations to oppose these structures. One of the structures that they identify is the state, of course, and so they do not respect, or they operate oftentimes outside the bounds of the state, and they also embrace the use of violence. And so the extremist part to their ideology comes from their engagement of violence, and also their anti-democratic nature, their opposition to the democratic state. And so they use violence. They attack their opponents. So far they haven't murdered anyone yet. So there is, who knows? But there is they're not as violent as right-wing extremists. Right-wing extremists have the monopoly almost on murder and death and things of that nature. So there is a distinction between right and left-wing extremism in that sense. But they do engage in forms of violence. They do physically attack opponents, mostly from the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. They also attack the houses, they burn cars, they attack offices, political offices of various political parties. And so this violence is important for two reasons, I guess. One is it ties back into this notion of moral obligation. So they have an obligation to oppose these structures of fascism. And so that's the motivating factor for them. That's why they do it. But there's also a very interesting factor which looks at this violence as a form of ritual. Because when you engage in an act of violence, often it's in groups, and it's an activity that's shared amongst a group of people. It's in the name of the same shared ideology, so they're sharing in the same ideas, and they're also engaging in a collective emotional experience. And so that's something very interesting, I think, in my analysis, as I look at this violence as a form of ritual that maybe unconsciously for them serves to reinforce their dedication or their adherence to these ideas. And so those are some of the key takeaways from the Autonomen. And when it comes to the NPD, I should also clarify that a lot of the right-wing extremist violence committed in Germany it's not necessarily by people from the NPD or people associated with it, but it's committed by people in groups, small groups, terrorist cells, or smaller political parties that more or less share the same ideology as the NPD. Okay. So I should make that distinction clear. When it comes to the NPD with their ideology and also the ideology of people engaging in right-wing extremism, it's basically the same. What you have is, as the sacred object, is a biological notion of the folk, the German people, the German race, and they are very strict about that. They do not want any immigration into Germany. They don't want any immigrants to stay in Germany. They basically want everyone in Germany to be ethnically German. And so you'll have this very homogeneous society. And so that's their sacred object. It's this idea, this concept of the folk, the German folk. And the moral ideal, the society, the perfect society that they want to bring into existence is the racially homogeneous, the pure Volksgemeinschaft, in English, the national community, I guess. And that's the society they want to live in. That's the society they want to bring about. And so some of their moral obligations is anti-capitalism is actually one of their moral obligations. They also are opposed to capitalism, which they see as an international finance operation that does not serve the interests of the nation, but it serves the interests of itself. And there's also quite a bit of anti-Semitic connotations that go along with that particular obligation. But so they are socialists, but they're national socialists. And there are also other moral obligations to be very much opposed to immigration. They're very much opposed to anti-multiculturalism, anti-feminism, they're anti a lot of stuff, basically. They're opposed to a lot of things. And the elites is also one of the politicians who are in power who are bringing about this multicultural reality that they don't want. They're also very much opposed to that. So, right, and so what do they do? It's kind of the same with the Autonomen. It's just with the NPD, it's the violence is much more violent. and they physically attack people, and there have been a spate of murders in Germany very recently of politicians and ethnic minorities that have been very troubling to the country, and so the degree of violence is much higher. I should make that very clear. But they are extremist in the same sense as the Autonomen. They use violence to achieve their political goals, and they are also anti-democratic in their nature. And in the same way as with the Autonomen, the violence here has a double component. In one sense, it is the fulfillment of a sort of moral obligation, but it's also when it's done in groups and not by lone wolf terrorists. It is also a form of ritual, collective ritual, and whoops, this thing almost fell off. Right, it's a ritual in the same sense. People sharing the same ideas, acting in the same way, and that creates this sui generis emotion that motivate, and that's what motivates them to do as they do. And so that's basically how I explain. That's how I explain this violence, extremist violence. It comes back to this notion of sui generis, the emotional attachments that people have when they engage in group rituals, and oftentimes these rituals can take place online, as was discussed in the previous presentation. So rituals can take place in a variety of different ways. So I guess the last point I'll say is that another very interesting thing from what I've studied is that this idea of mutual sacrilege. So you have the NPD and the Autonomen. If you look at what their sacred objects are, if you look at what their moral obligations are, they are mutually sacrilegious to each other. And what that means is that the sacred object for the NPD, for example, inherently is sacrilegious to the sacred object of the Autonomen, and vice versa. So the Autonomen see the ideas and the politics of the NPD as inherently evil, and they oppose it completely. And the NPD feel exactly the same way about the Autonomen. And so they're locked in this cycle of mutual antagonism and violence, because whatever one does, the other will find completely appalling, and so they'll respond. And in responding, they will transgress the sacred object of the other group. And so it creates this spiral of they're sort of locked into this cycle of antagonism and violence. So I think that's a very interesting observation to make, which is why I wrote it in my book. So, but that's the end of my presentation. I guess we have some time for questions now. Yeah.